Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
It was an extraordinary moment at an unprecedented summit. President Trump and Kim Jong-un walked towards each other in front of the world's media and then shook hands in front of North Korean and American flags. It's the first time in history that a sitting US president has met a North Korean leader. After a face-to-face meeting, they signed an agreement to work to rid the Korean peninsula of nuclear weapons. President Trump later announced that America would suspend its military exercises in the region. But critics are already saying that the summit lacked substance. Here's our North America editor, John Sopel. His report contains flash photography.
It was carefully choreographed, dramatically staged, and yet still somehow utterly unbelievable. Both men walking stiffly, with nervous smiles. The handshake lasted 12 seconds, the president saying it was an honour to meet Kim Jong-un. Has North Korea ever been given a platform like this? 9 months ago, Donald Trump was calling him Little Rocket Man, and Little Rocket Man was calling him a mentally deranged dotard. Now they're walking together and sharing a laugh.
I feel really great. We're going to have a great discussion, and I think tremendous success. We'll be tremendously successful. We will have a terrific relationship, I have no doubt.
From Kim Jong-un, a rather different rhetorical style. It hadn't been easy to get here, he said. The past had acted as fetters on our limbs, and old prejudices worked as obstacles, but we overcame all of them. The pair met with just their translators initially, and were then joined by officials. The talks lasted most of the morning. Detractors have said this meeting would be nothing more than a glorified photo op. It's much more than that, but there were enough pictures to fill an album. There was the balcony scene.
Very good.
The walk in the gardens.
It's going great.
And the boys and their toys moment, when Chairman Kim wanted to see inside the beast, the president's famous limo. But then came the important moment, the signing of a document apparently committing North Korea to complete denuclearization, even if it was rather longer on intent than concrete steps to get there.
Would you like to say something to the press?
We had a historic meeting and decided to leave the past behind.
The document contained 4 key points: agreeing to establish new relations, joining together to build a lasting and stable peace, working towards the complete denuclearization of the Korean peninsula, and recovering the remains of prisoners of war.
7 billion people inhabit planet Earth.
Before Donald Trump's news conference, the journalists were shown a propaganda-style video produced by the Americans, extolling the great denuclearized future ahead.
2 men, 2 leaders, 1 destiny.
But missing from it, and the agreement, were 2 key US demands: that the process must be irreversible and verifiable, and that looked like a negotiating victory for the North Koreans.
Well, thank you very much, everybody.
And that was a repeated question for Donald Trump. The North Koreans had reneged on promises before, so why would this time be different?
Well, you have a different administration. You have a different president. You have a different Secretary of State. You have people that are, it's very important to them, and we get it done. The other groups, maybe it wasn't a priority. I don't think they could have done it if it was a priority.
Another victory for the North Koreans seemed to be this declaration from the US president, a pledge that took South Korea by surprise.
We will be stopping the war games, which will save us a tremendous amount of money, unless and until we see that the future negotiation is not going along like it should. But we'll be saving a tremendous amount of money. Plus, I think it's very provocative.
The president lavished praise on Kim Jong-un, but that brought this question.
The man you met today, Kim Jong-un, as you know, has killed family members, has starved his own people. Why are you so comfortable calling him very talented?
Well, he is very talented. Anybody that takes over a situation like he did at 26 years of age and is able to run it and run it tough. I don't say he was nice or I don't say anything about it. He ran it. Very few people at that age, you can take 1 out of 10,000 probably couldn't do it.
And then Donald Trump, the former property developer, set out the economic opportunities for a North Korea at peace with its neighbours.
Well, they have great beaches. You see that whenever they're exploding their cannons into the ocean, right? So I said, boy, look at that beach. Wouldn't that make a great condo behind? And I explained, I said, you know, instead of doing that, you could have the best hotels in the world right there.
From this remarkable meeting ground where the flags fly side by side, Donald Trump now sees a future where the US and North Korea are working together. The word historic is often overused. Today, it was justified. Extraordinary strides have been taken to get to this point. But it's what happens next that is really crucial. How do you ensure that North Korea keeps its word on denuclearization? To that question, Donald Trump said, well, you're going to have to trust me. John Sopel, BBC News, Singapore.
Well, it certainly is an extraordinary turn of events, with Donald Trump now saying he has formed a special bond with the North Korean leader. So what impact could that have? This report from our Seoul correspondent Laura Bicker contains flashing images from the start.
It was a stunning moment for South Koreans in Singapore. They told me their hearts were racing as they watched. Full of hope, but also relief that these two leaders are talking instead of declaring war. Chen Nam-suk couldn't wait to phone her mum, who was born in Pyongyang. After seeing this, I suddenly thought how I wanted to go back to North Korea before I die, she says. Mum, I want your dream to come true. I want you to step back on North Korean land. In Seoul, President Moon Jae-in admitted he'd had a sleepless night, but looked jubilant at the meeting, which was partly the result of his careful diplomacy. But Donald Trump had a surprise for him. He pledged to end what he described as war games, joint military exercises between South Korea and the US. They've always angered the North. This will worry neighbouring Japan, as will Mr. Trump's suggestion to remove troops from the peninsula in the future.
It's a mistake to cancel all joint US-South Korea military exercises. The United States needs to maintain sufficient level of readiness and preparedness on the peninsula because the North Korean nuclear threat is still there.
Kim Jong-un has now signed 2 agreements to denuclearize. The first was in April, but both lack detail. He has destroyed his main nuclear test site and has promised to dismantle another. But he could be hiding up to 60 nuclear weapons, and it's not clear he's letting inspectors in to find them. That's why many will find today's announcement disappointing.
Kim Jong-un is now leaving the island of Sentosa, having gained the summit and the status he's longed for. He says the world will change. The problem is, we're not sure what that change may mean.
Kim Jong-un has promised to avoid the mistakes of the past. Failed policies in the 1990s led to a famine which killed thousands. His father and grandfather built weapons while people went hungry. The missile launches have stopped for now, and China appears eager to help, already pushing for sanctions to be lifted. Today, North Korea took its first tentative steps out of the shadows. But just how far it's prepared to go is still uncertain. Laura Bicker, BBC News, Singapore.
Well, let's talk to our North America editor, John Sopel, who is in Singapore. Really incredible scenes in Singapore earlier today. The big question, though, is, in the long term, could this really make a difference?
Well, Sophie, it has been remarkable. I sort of wish my smartphone had a rub your eyes in disbelief emoji or a jaw-dropping emoji, because what has unfolded has been really momentous. Now, it's been a good few days for Donald Trump. He's managed to get this summit when many people said it would never happen. He's built up a relationship with Kim Jong-un. That can only be a good thing. But I thought what was very vague at his news conference is what comes next. What are the next steps that need to be taken to build confidence on both sides? What are the measures against which this agreement is going to be judged? On that, it was very vague. So a good few days for Donald Trump, I think an excellent few days for Kim Jong-un, because he has appeared on the world stage almost as an equal to the United States, no longer the leader of a pariah nation. And there was the remarkable walkabout where he did, where he was sort of almost given rock star status with people cheering him. That may encourage him further to come out of the shadows. But it's no comprehensive peace agreement has been reached yet, and it may be that there isn't one. We'll have to see what unfolds over the coming weeks and months. But what we are in a position of is of de-escalation of the tension in the peninsula. The missile tests have stopped. Now, 9 months ago, when there was the hurling of insults, people thought the missiles might start flying as well. That hasn't happened. That seems a long way off. And I'm sure people around the world will be breathing a little easier as a result of what's happened in Singapore today.
John Sopel, thank you.
By coming here and holding this summit, Donald Trump has shown he's prepared to gamble in the cause of peace. And if nothing else, he's transformed the rhetoric from dark threats about nuclear annihilation to warm words about friendship and new beginnings. The president left with a deal he acclaimed light on detail, and it appears to come with a clutch of concessions by the US, which no one had predicted. More on that in a moment. But first, the day that was here in Singapore. To your right, it's President Donald J. Trump who appears first in the portico. On the left, through the arches, you might recognize the rolling step of the rogue state chairman Kim Jong-un, about to achieve a moment of recognition that evaded both his father and grandfather. Behind the handshake no one could have predicted even a few months ago, but there it is. The stars and stripes folded against the Republic's red star, symbolizing communism and socialism. But this is no time for isms. As they move into the wings, they appear to chat. Kim has an observation to share. He tells his translator, who tells Trump, many people in the world will think this is fantasy, something from a science fiction movie. In all, it took just over a minute, as long as President Trump said it would take to know by touch and by feel whether Kim Jong-un is serious about getting rid of his nuclear weapons and signing a peace agreement.
This is what's happening. It is right there. It's within our reach. It's going to be there. It's going to happen. People thought this could never take place. It is now taking place.
The North Korean leader was bundled into his car with military precision this morning to begin the short drive to Sentosa. Ahead of him, President Trump was already on his way. Yes, this is Donald Trump driving down. There's his convoy heading down towards Sentosa Island. An extraordinary moment. He wants the world to see a master deal maker, the kind of president who may divide America but might yet unite the Korean peninsula. Kim Jong-un pulled up to the hotel not wearing his glasses, but he was clear-sighted in his aims here. He was seeking legitimacy from the leader of the most powerful country on earth. And within a matter of minutes, it appeared he had it.
And it's my honor, and we will have a terrific relationship, I have no doubt.
President Trump sounded effusive, incredibly positive, already impressed, even though they just met. As he hears the translation of the president's words, the North Korean leader begins to smile with evident delight. As for his words, they're more soberly chosen. He speaks of the old prejudices and practices that served as obstacles to this way forward. But, he says, we overcame all of them, and here we are today.
Please, Chairman.
On to lunch, and the president turns on the Trump charm.
Getting a good picture of everybody so we look nice and handsome and thin.
Beautiful.
Perfect.
Handsome and thin, he demands from the photographers for the leader he once called short and fat. But that was then, and this is now.
역사적인 이 만남에서 지난 과거를 덮고 새로운 출발을 알리는 그 역사적인 문건에 서명을 하게 됩니다.
Today, we had a historic meeting and decided to leave the past behind, and we are about to sign a historic document. The world will see a major change.
They each signed with a flourish, but what's in the deal really? We're just waiting on Donald Trump to begin a press conference here where on Sentosa Island Kim Jong-un has now left. There is a great deal of anticipation here though, and a desire for more detail on this statement that both leaders have signed. I've got to say on the surface it seems very thin. It details a kind of a commitment to denuclearization. It talks about establishing new relations and a desire for peace. But there's absolutely no detail on how that's going to be achieved, nor is there any kind of time frame.
Destiny Pictures presents a story of opportunity.
But before there was any detail on the deal, there was this bizarre trailer for it, complete with dramatic orchestration and a Hollywood voiceover.
Will this leader choose to advance his country and be part of a new world? Will he shake the hand of peace? Featuring President Donald Trump and Chairman Kim Jong-un in a meeting to remake history.
That was a tape that we gave to Chairman Kim and his people. Captures what could be done. As an example, they have great beaches. You see that whenever they're exploding their cannons into the ocean, right? I said, boy, look at that. Wouldn't that make a great condo behind? Think of it from a real estate perspective. You have South Korea, you have China, and they own the land in the middle. How bad is that, right? It's great.
But before he builds the Pyongyang Trump Hotel, what about the tens of thousands of North Korean citizens checked into gulags they can never leave? What about Kim starving his own people and killing family members? Is it right that President Trump described him today as very talented?
Well, he is very talented. Anybody that takes over a situation like he did at 26 years of age and is able to run it, and run it tough. I don't say he was nice, or I don't say anything about it. He ran it. Very few people at that age, you can take 1 out of 10,000 probably couldn't do it.
So what about the deal and the scarcity of detail on how denuclearization might happen? Why isn't that in the text?
Because there's no time. I'm here one day. We're together for many hours intensively, but the process is now going to take place. Great personality and very smart. Good combination.
It sounded like the best review of a first date ever at the final photo op. One last moment to declare success before the hard work of making the deal a reality hits home. There was some more detail on the deal from President Trump at that lengthy press conference he gave before he left, but much of it is not actually hardwired into the text. He mentioned at least one major concession by the US, namely suspending its military exercises with South Korea. Now, that's definitely something that was on the North's wish list, which caught off guard apparently both the Pentagon and the South Korean military. Make no mistake, this was Kim Jong-un's day. But how much do ordinary North Koreans know of what's going on in their name? Earlier I spoke to Raf Wober of the Associated Press in Pyongyang and began by asking what they'd been told.
It might come as a big surprise, but really here in Pyongyang there's been nothing of what the world has been watching of what's going on in Singapore today.
Is that likely to come as a surprise for North Koreans who are turning on their televisions to learn that Kim Jong-un has travelled to Singapore, that he's meeting with the Americans?
I think that when it comes to the images of the DPRK North Korean leader having this summit with the US president, I'm sure that these images will be gobsmacking for most people here. Really, it is something completely unprecedented, and I think that adjectives like historic and unprecedented which could be thrown around lightly, in this case really will be appropriate to use.
President Trump has said here today that he expects that Kim Jong-un is going to arrive back in Pyongyang and immediately get on with the business of denuclearization, that's something that he will attempt as soon as he sets foot back inside North Korea. Does that sound likely to you? Are you expecting to learn of that? Will that be broadcast if it is happening within North Korea?
I don't think that this is something we're going to see on the streets of Pyongyang in slogans or in rhetoric. I don't think it's something which we'll see unfolding in front of our eyes day by day. But I do think that what we would be looking for would be, for example, visits by the International Atomic Energy Authority and other kinds of international engagement which take North Korea down the path to which it is committed at the Singapore summit. But I don't think that it will be something that is part of public discussion here or something which is highlighted until the specific agreements are reached on specific steps to take.
Raf, given what we know about what the North Koreans have achieved here, what Kim Jong-un has achieved from this meeting with Donald Trump, what do you think of that? I mean, how substantial is it?
Even if there's doubt amongst some analysts, this is the first major step which could probably take a new relationship with the US forward. From the North Korean point of view, it will be celebrated as a big success, and that will create momentum, hopefully, to take it forward together with the US if the US is willing to have the patience or the interest to continue following up this process.
Now, Hyun-seo Lee is a North Korean defector who now lives in South Korea and has written a book about her experiences. Earlier this year, in fact, she met President Trump. She told me from her home in Seoul that watching the summit today was a very emotional experience.
When they're shaking their hands at each other, I felt somehow really emotions. And then I was really super worried when they're talking. The past, everything, that when North Korean people were suffering, and then all the tensions between America and North Korea, everything, and human rights issues, everything is all stuck together for me. And then I was thinking that moments could bring some, light for North Korean people. That's why I feel so emotional.
President Trump did address the issue of human rights, although quite fleetingly at the press conference today. He said that it had been raised with Kim Jong-un. It was something that they had spoken about. And he said that he felt confident that in the longer term, the conditions of those who are held in prison camps in North Korea would be alleviated by the kind of opening that we saw today between the two countries. Do you believe him?
As you know, that I met the President Trump at the White House this February, and then along 7 North Korean defectors, and then I saw his eyes that he was so mad about the human rights issues in North Korea. He knows so many details, and then I saw somehow the willingness he would bring the changes in terms of human rights issues, and then pressure on China with this, and then especially North Korea. So I really, really believed or hoping that he gonna mention about that. But on the same time, I was maybe worried that he didn't want it to annoy Kim Jong-un at this time, because for America's situation, maybe then human rights, the denuclearization is the most important. And then exactly that happened, what I was worrying today. But I know this meeting will not be end at just the once, and this will be, I hope it will be keep going, and then I surely believe that President Trump will bring up these issues next time.
So how does today's meeting compare to historic peace summits between world leaders? Think Nixon in China or Reagan and Gorbachev. But North Korea is not a great power, just an impoverished country with a nuclear weapon and a history of cheating on diplomatic deals. So is this the beginning of a real shift in world affairs? Here's our international editor, Lindsay Hilsum.
Outside the palace, the big three posed for dozens of cameramen.
1944. Roosevelt and Churchill met Stalin to shape the peace after World War II. 1972, Nixon met Mao, and a quarter-century of animosity between America and China was dispelled. 1986, Reagan met Gorbachev, and the Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union began to unfreeze. 2018, Trump met Kim, and it's hard to tell if anything was achieved beyond the meeting itself. This is diplomacy back to front, the leaders meeting before the groundwork has been laid, signing an agreement that says nothing very much, because diplomats are yet to hammer out the detail.
It's a very broad, vague statement of intent, which is useful. It shows political intent, but let's not overestimate it. All the hard work of actually negotiating the details, the same kinds of details that have made previous agreements with North Korea fail, all of that has been pushed until later for Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and his North Korean counterpart to work out.
This isn't the past. This isn't another administration that never got it started and therefore never got it done.
Well, actually, they did. In 1994, a Democratic administration persuaded North Korea to freeze its nuclear program, but Republican congressmen scuppered the deal by refusing to lift sanctions, and eventually the North Koreans reneged. In 2005, after years of multilateral talks, the North Koreans agreed to abandon their nuclear weapons. But the deal was blown sky high 4 years later when they launched a long-range rocket. Successive North Korean leaders have longed for a picture like this. Two equals, two statesmen, two nuclear powers. It's win-win for Kim and for Trump's image as a peacemaker. But has either side made any real concessions? Every year, the US holds joint military exercises with the South Koreans. It's not clear whether Mr. Trump told his allies in Seoul that he decided to stop that, seemingly with no trade-off from the North.
We'll be saving a tremendous amount of money. Plus, I think it's very provocative.
The cult of Kim seems to have impressed the American president, who doesn't get a reception like this in his country.
He's going to be happy. His country does love him. His people, you see the fervor. They have a great fervor.
The Singapore summit was headline news in China, where the American president's impulsive diplomacy makes bureaucrats quake. But there, as elsewhere in the region, leaders have expressed support. The Japanese Prime Minister said it was a step forward towards a comprehensive resolution. The South Korean presidential spokesman said it was a great victory for the US and the two Koreas.
Can history be changed?
Because however off the wall the promotional video and unconventional the diplomacy, as long as they're talking, they're not fighting. And you never know, it might just work.
So how is this summit going down around the world? Matt Fry is in Washington, but first, Alex Thompson a little earlier in Moscow.
Yes, well, it is June the 12th. It is National Day in Russia. Public holidays. The country celebrates its break with the old dispensation, the communist era, back in the last century. And the move from the Kremlin tonight, well, broadly speaking, I think they're saying we're in favour of good, but we'd quite like to see what the production of goodness is actually like. There's a bit of a but in all this, and the but was articulated today by the Deputy Foreign Minister. He said we need to see what this is all about, and, quote, the devil is in the detail. They do say this is a step towards denuclearization in the Korean Peninsula. They do say it is a step towards peace. But I think the Deputy Foreign Minister speaks for millions around the world tonight, because there is no detail to speak of, at least so far as the communique which was issued in Singapore is concerned. More widely, the Kremlin saying tonight they see this as a chance to reopen a long-term diplomatic process, the six-country process, which has really fallen into disrepair. Who knew? Well, it involved Russia, it involved the United States, China, Japan, and the two Korean countries themselves. But as I say, that has gone into the long grass for many years now. And could it be, they were saying here tonight, that the Don of all people, President Trump, has cut the Gordian knot and got this process moving faster than many could have possibly imagined? Well, that's possible, but until we see what this is all about, the Kremlin, I suspect, none of them going out and putting any money and any bets on that happening. There have, as we've already said tonight, been too many false dawns as regards peace in the Korean Peninsula.
Now, thinking about that remark you made about those wonderful North Korean beaches, I guess it shows you one thing, that you can take the president out of real estate, but you can never take real estate out of this particular president. Now, looking at the numbers, according to the opinion polls, and of course they matter especially to Donald Trump, 40% of the nation likes him, 85% of the Republican loves him because of a variety of things, and this will only vindicate them. Now, if you don't like Donald Trump, you would have spent the morning picking over this agreement with North Korea and picking holes into it about verification and military exercises, etc., etc. If you like him, you would have dusted off your application for the Nobel Peace Prize. I don't think, certainly, judging from what's happened this morning, that this moves the dial fundamentally in one direction or the other. The jury is still very much out because we don't know what the follow-up will be. But I'll tell you one thing, people will remember this image much more than they will follow up on any kind of details of verification. And if Trump has proven one thing again, it is the power of a politician, to quote George W. Bush, of being misunderestimated by others. Kylie.
Thanks, Matt. More from you later in the programme. That's it from us, though, here in Singapore for now.
Well, the divisions here are clear this morning once the dust has settled from that historic summit in Singapore. If you watched Fox News, and this was an unadulterated triumph, they are literally calling up the Nobel Prize Committee right now to refresh that application. If you watched MSNBC, the so-called liberal channel, well, then it's a different story. Then Trump has been cozying up to a dictator and turning his back on his closest allies. Bad news for geopolitics, they would say. Now, we watched the historic event with some Americans and wondered what they thought of their negotiator-in-chief. The Korean Memorial in Washington, D.C. perfectly captures the war it commemorates. Soldiers frozen in mid-maneuver for a conflict still looking for closure after 7 decades. Soldier 16 was modeled on Major Bill Weber. Here in stone, here in photo, and here in person, on his front porch in rural Maryland. 92 years old, the Korean War defined his life after almost ending it.
I lost the arm first. Yeah. And as it was sometime after midnight, it was a Chinese hand grenade that did it. There was no pain, and the blood almost immediately congealed. It was about that far out. And I was aware of it, but not concerned. I mean, that sounds kind of stupid. Yeah, I knew I'd lost an arm, but it was not the most important thing that was happening at that moment.
And the leg?
Well, that was about 2.5 hours later. That put me down, of course,
Bill has voted both Democrat and Republican, and for someone who gave limbs and nearly life to his country, he is more aware than most of the stakes of the Singapore talks. What would you say to Donald Trump?
That the ultimate goal should be the unification of the Korean people, long term, okay? It is inevitable that if there's an agreement is reached, it has to have inherent to it now that Kim Jong-un will survive.
But do you think that's the right thing to do, considering that he's a brutal dictator who's enslaved his own people? Are we not giving him the lifeline and the money to carry on?
Yeah, it's one of the adjustments that you have to make in diplomacy and world history. If we want to denuclearize North Korea, then we have to allow him to stay in power.
And what about Trump, the negotiator?
He's it, okay? Everything's riding on him. And those of our people who naysay him are in effect denying to him the kind of support that he should get. He has his faults, but he also has his good points. He deserves to be supported.
America is bitterly divided over this president. Much of the country hates him,
but not here on Wood Spice Lane in affluent Virginia. The Buckler Shorts are true Trump believers. The president is a permanent guest in their house. They've invited a dozen of their best friends from the Virginia Women for Trump Club to witness a chunk of history with a slice of pizza. On Fox News, where else?
Let's watch this.
Everything that he does works. He always comes out, as you would say, smelling like a rose, because he knows exactly what he's doing. But at the same time, he's authentic.
The world has better got to adapt, because this is the president of the 21st century. We finally have a president, after 65 years since that Korean War, that is coming forward and has the fortitude to say no more.
But he's upset the Canadians, the Germans, the French, the British, the Japanese at the G7 summit.
He's upset those people because they've been taking advantage of America for a great deal of time.
Message to the world is,
we're happy to help.
get in line.
We're happy to be part of the solution, but we need fair. We need it to be fair.
Deal with it.
Deal with it.
Dealing with it. That is what Bill Weber has been doing all his life. The divisions in Korea once almost killed him. The divisions in melting pot America today depress him.
The fire has gone out underneath the melting pot. I hate to say that, but I believe that, and I believe a great many of my generation believe that, okay? I just see an ever-growing division in our people, and that can be the demise of the great experiment that was the United States.
Bill Weber ending that report of mine on the Korean War and indeed the summit. Now with me to discuss some of the implications here on the roof in Washington, Ian Bremmer, head of the Eurasia Group, and Ned Price, former National Security Advisor to President Obama. Thanks to both of you for coming on the program. Ned Price, should President Obama be sending his Nobel Peace Prize to Donald Trump?
Well, Donald Trump is certainly going to be claiming he deserves a Nobel Peace Prize for this. In fact, he's already done so. And his campaign, his 2020 re-election campaign, has already announced a rally at which North Korea will be featured prominently. Everything Donald Trump does in his own mind is the greatest that's ever happened. It's unprecedented. It's historical. I think.
But he has taken a risk for peace, a risk that President Obama did not take.
Well, it's a risk that President Obama, frankly, President Clinton, and perhaps even presidents before him could have taken had they chosen to go down that path.
But they didn't.
But they didn't because the time was not right. Whether this is actually the right time to get something comprehensive, verifiable, and irreversible, that we just don't yet know.
But if we don't risk Ian Bremmer, we won't achieve anything.
Well, saying the time wasn't right, I mean, obviously over the past 25 years, and not just about Obama, we've gotten a North Korea with a much greater nuclear arsenal, with ICBMs that can now hit the American mainland.
So someone should have taken the risk earlier.
Well, you know, in other words, if there are lots of rational reasons to be risk-averse and push it off to your kids, it's kind of like climate change, but eventually the bill does come due. So Trump is stuck with a much more difficult situation now. He's not risk-averse. He's not very strategic. And he's like, I can do it, nobody else can. Look, I mean, Obama didn't deserve the Nobel, and Obama himself recognized that. Trump certainly isn't in a position where he can collect one yet. We do have to recognize that the reason why this summit was made possible is not just because Trump was talking about fire and fury, but he also linked Chinese economic relationship to if they helped him on North Korea. They squeezed North Korea a lot harder. That facilitated the opening.
He talked about beaches in his press conference. And he talked about, you know, the wonderful Korean people, and he, of course, praised Kim Jong-un again and again. No one today really is talking much about human rights.
No, we're not at all. And there actually is a strategic reason for that. I think it is fair to say that the North Korean nuclear threat itself is the biggest threat we've faced. And so it does make sense to some extent to carve out this challenge and really focus on this, because everything North Korea does, whether it's its human rights abuses, whether it's cyber attacks, whether it's its money counterfeiting for that matter, all of it is magnified and made all that much more difficult to solve if North Korea still has this nuclear deterrent.
I mean, Trump believes firmly in the power of personal chemistry. You know, the sort of, you know, faith-based geopolitics, if you like. Do you think this will work?
It's hard to use Trump and faith-based in the same sentence, but it works for the evangelicals. Look, this is going to work insofar as the North Koreans recognize making Trump feel good is getting them somewhere. But the Chinese are much more important to them. And so ultimately, that's who they're going to make happy. Even though Trump personally gets to say he makes history, in 5 years' time, we're going to look back on this and say, wow, China's much more important to North Korea today than they were before. The Americans are kind of marginalized. That's where we're heading.
Is this win-win for Kim?
Well, we certainly haven't seen a loss yet for Kim. What Kim got over the course of the past 24 hours was legitimacy on the international stage and a tremendous concession from President Trump in the announcement that the U.S. and the Republic of Korea, South Korea, would halt our joint military exercises. We really, the United States and our allies in this, have really not gotten anything concrete in return yet from Kim Jong-un.
Right, but we are still threatening them with continued sanctions.
Well, we got something concrete from them in advance, which is they suspended their ICBM, a nuclear test. The Chinese wanted that freeze for freeze. They now have it. Okay,
the big question is, are we now seeing the reality of the Trump doctrine, which is zero-sum politics, right? Your loss is my win, and you do individual transactions. You don't care about international alliances.
Yeah, there's no strategy. It's not long-term. The American political system doesn't do long-term anyway, but specifically Trump really doesn't. It's not values-based, it's individual, and it redounds to, can I push these guys around?
Is the West broken as an alliance?
Well, certainly Donald Trump hasn't done anything to bring us back together. We saw what happened at the G Summit just before he took off for Singapore. I think the West is as frayed as it has been in recent memory, possibly since the end of World War II. And this is something that can't be repaired overnight, maybe not even in this presidency, the way it's going.
Ned Price, Ian Bremer, got to leave it there. Well, you heard it, lots of misgivings here, but we have given Donald Trump, or they have given Donald Trump, his moment in history for now.
Put the two most unpredictable world leaders in the same room and anything could have happened, and yet President Trump and Kim Jong-un stuck mainly to the script, creating their own chapter of international history. When they met at today's summit, they locked hands, then seized the moment, if not firm plans for peace. What they agreed was a first step rather than the final deal. But President Trump did make one unexpected concession, an end to joint military manoeuvres with South Korea. In return, Kim said he'd consider scrapping North Korea's nuclear weapons. Mr. Trump had the more upbeat language, but Mr. Kim did say the world will see a major change.
Just months ago, this moment would have been unthinkable. Their handshake lasted 18 long seconds. An image that has led to gasps around the region and beyond. A North Korean leader and an American president meeting for the very first time. Donald Trump had already declared he would know instinctively if he could trust Kim Jong-un. And sure enough, the verdict came almost immediately.
It's my honor, and we will have a terrific relationship, I have no doubt.
Kim talked of overcoming deep suspicion.
여기까지 오는 길이 그리 쉬운 길은 아니에요. 우리한테는 우리 발목을 잡는 그 과거가 있고 또 그릇된 국민과 발행들이 우리 때로는 우리 눈과 귀를 가리고 있었는데 우리 모든 것을 이겨내고 이 자리까지 왔습니다.
The Americans have been insisting that Kim dismantles his entire nuclear arsenal.
Very, very good. Excellent relationship. Thank you.
For Trump, the chemistry seemed more important than the details. And that has given his critics the sense that the president may have made concessions to a leader half his age, and in return received only vague promises.
We had a really fantastic meeting. A lot of progress, really very positive. I think better than anybody could have expected. Top of the line, really good.
Mr. President,
We're going right now for a signing.
Has he agreed to give up any nuclear weapons, sir?
No answer then, and not much clarity later. The young dictator of the world's most reclusive nation certainly spoke of change, but nothing specific.
새로운 출발을 알리는 그 역사적인 문건에 서명을 하게 됩니다.
Today, we had a historic meeting and decided to leave the past behind, and we are about to sign a historic document.
세상은 아마 중대한 변화를 보게 될 것입니다.
The world will see a major change.
The deal is that America provides security guarantees, giving North Korea the confidence to dismantle its nuclear weapons. But there are questions of monitoring and verification. Observers quick to point out that similar promises have been made and broken in the past, though Trump said this time it is different.
We both want to do something. We both are going to do something. And we have developed a very special bond. So people are going to be very impressed. People are going to be very happy.
and we're going to take care of a very big and very dangerous problem for the world. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Will you invite Chairman Kim to the White House?
Absolutely, I will.
It's astonishing to recall that just months ago Trump was calling Kim a madman and threatening North Korea with fire and fury. At this extraordinary summit today inside this resort, the clearest winner was Chairman Kim. He has been given parity with a US president, and his heavily sanctioned regime, at a stroke, has won international legitimacy. At his press conference, Trump largely avoided talking about human rights. But I put it to the president that there are some who may be appalled by his sudden support for Kim. I wonder what you would say to the group of people who have no ability whatsoever to hear or to see this press conference, the 100,000 North Koreans kept in a network of gulags. Have you betrayed them by legitimizing the regime in Pyongyang?
No, I think I've helped them because I think things will change. I think I've helped them. There's nothing I can say. All I can do is do what I can do. We have to stop the nuclearization. We have to do other things, and that's a very important thing. So at a certain point, hopefully, you'll be able to ask me a much more positive question.
And then he surprised many by revealing he was cancelling all further military exercises with South Korea.
It's inappropriate to be having war games. So number one, we save money a lot. And number two, it really is something that I think they very much appreciated.
The president ended the summit with further praise for Kim, calling him a worthy negotiator.
I learned he's a very talented man. I also learned that he loves his country very much.
And then they departed. An astonishing day that can only be assessed once we know whether Kim intends to abandon the very weapons that allowed him to pull off this diplomatic coup. The president left this island resort after just 7 hours of negotiations. His fate now inextricably linked to decisions being made in Pyongyang. Typically, Trump was in a buoyant mood, sharing none of the doubts being expressed by those who wonder whether an American president has just been outmaneuvered by a diplomatic novice from a pariah state. Robert Moore, News at 10, Singapore.
Well, as of yet, the scenes from Singapore that have been flashed around the world since the early hours haven't actually been shown in North Korea. In South Korea, they have been watching, of course, and hoping the summit will create better relations with the North. And no one was watching more closely than the South's President Moon, who helped bring the summit about with his own meeting with Kim. But even he was surprised by President Trump's announcement about ending their joint military exercises.
He admitted to being unable to sleep ahead of the summit. President Moon was instrumental in making it happen, and with a slow nod and a smile, it was perhaps with some relief that he watched as the two leaders came together. He had gathered with his cabinet in Seoul to follow a meeting in which South Korea had so much at stake.
I join all the people in hoping to bring complete denuclearization and peace and usher in a new era for the two Koreas and the United States.
But Donald Trump's agreement to stop their joint military exercises appears to have blindsided the South Koreans. A government spokesman said the president's remarks required clearer understanding, while US forces Korea revealed they had been given no information regarding any suspension of training. The annual defence drills, which last took place in April, are primarily designed to prepare for an attack from the north. In Seoul, there is a group of staunch Trump supporters who today said they felt let down by the United States. They believe the meeting with Kim Jong-un should never have gone ahead and fear the consequences of too many concessions.
We don't want a political show. North Korea has to, for once and for all, get rid of its nuclear and chemical weapons and solve its human rights issues.
I don't know why President Trump is talking to them. How could he betray us like this? It makes me angry.
There is a momentum building, however, one which could mean these children will grow up only knowing of peacetime on the peninsula.
I hope they can get rid of nuclear weapons and our children will see reunification.
As a parent, of course, I want my child to live in a country without conflict.
Entering into dialogue with North Korea has its risks, but the reward could be a Korea finally free of the threat of war.
And Debbie is live in Seoul, where it's already early morning. Morning to you, Debbie. The US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo due to arrive there later. What sort of reception is he likely to get, do you think?
Well, he's coming directly from Singapore to brief South Korean and Japanese officials personally on exactly what has been agreed and discussed in Singapore. And I think top of his agenda will be providing some clarity on that decision of Donald Trump to end these joint military exercises, with the Vice President Mike Pence having subsequently told members of the Senate that some exercises will continue. These key US allies in the region will also be looking for a reassurance that there will be no US troop withdrawal from the peninsula. Mike Pompeo will move on from Seoul to Beijing, where he will meet with President Xi. China, of course, a key ally of North Korea, and as a signatory of the original armistice agreement, they will have to be part of any peace treaty negotiations going forward. Oblivious to all of this are the people of North Korea. Kim Jong-un may have told Donald Trump that the world was watching them, but that did not include his own people, who are yet to learn of the outcome of the Singapore summit, and it will be fascinating to see what edited version of events is presented to them, perhaps later today.
Okay, Debbie, thank you very much indeed for that. Well, let's return now to Robert Moore, who's in Singapore. Robert, just an extraordinary 24 hours. As the dust starts to settle now, how do you assess that both leaders have fared?
I think you'd have to say, Julie, that the most ground given up front has certainly been the Americans, most obviously today, giving the ruling dynasty something they've craved for a generation, namely this extraordinary platform on which they want to build some respectability and legitimacy, but also suspending those joint exercises and skating over the vast array of human rights abuses in North Korea. Chairman Kim, in return, yes, he has released some hostages, he's blown up some tunnels, but there is no suggestion tonight that an army of weapons inspectors is about to go into North Korea, no suggestion that Kim is about to hand over a forensic accounting of his program of weapons of mass destruction, let alone hand over the actual nuclear warheads themselves. I think we're in an extraordinary place tonight. A US president has put his faith, his trust, even his legacy in the hands of a paranoid and repressive leader. In some ways, this is classic Trump, but just on a scale we've never seen before. Improvisational diplomacy based on a hunch, and it's either kind of remarkably reckless or a brilliant gamble. And right now, obviously, the jury is out.
Robert, we'll get a little more from behind the scenes at the summit a little later in the programme. Thank you very much indeed for that. And finally tonight we return to the Singapore summit, which was like no other, not least because of the personalities involved. Two eccentric and extreme characters strutting their stuff on the world stage. They signed their names into history, but interesting in a different way, the unwritten subtext of the encounter.
A new world can begin today.
It had all the hallmarks of the world's most famous reality TV star. This is the special White House video played at the summit to set the mood, the swagger, the hype, and the sometimes downright surreal.
Featuring President Donald Trump and Chairman Kim Jong-un.
And the prize encounter itself, a fascinating insight into the behaviour of the alpha male, instantly recognisable from east to west. And away from all the handshakes, there were other revealing moments of power at play. The joke at the dinner table.
Getting a good picture of everybody so they look nice and handsome and thin.
Beautiful.
Perfect.
Not necessarily shared by his opposite number, whom he'd once suggested was short and fat. And then the signing of the accord. It might have been short on content, but look at this pen. Polished and prepared by an official. Chairman Kim nearly had to sign with one carrying Trump's golden signature. But his sister, yes, she travelled with him, was having none of it. It might be mightier than the sword, but you still need to own your weapon. Then the battle of the signatures was closely followed by a moment straight out of presidential Top Gear. Look at my motor. Trump showing off his armour-plated car, known as the Beast, and specially flown in on Air Force One. As a spectacle, the last 24 hours have been as bizarre as they have been historic. A dictator and a disruptor side by side. Where does this go next? Well, we may find out a bit more tomorrow when Mike Pompeo heads to Seoul.
Put aside the theatre for a moment. What actually happened today? The US agreed to suspend its military exercises, or war games, with South Korea, a new concession. Then on top of that, there was a vague declaration that said fairly little. It repeated the loose commitment of the North to work towards denuclearization, and in return the US offered a loose security guarantee. So that's what substantively happened, but then there was also the theatre, the handshake, the flags, the posing for cameras, the small talk and the big talk. One senses that the show was the real action. The optics were everything. The bigging up of a dictator's ego, I mean Kim Jong-un there, in the hope that he'll follow the right course. The idea is that the flattery is too attractive for him to lose by following the wrong one. Well, overall, it was a remarkable sight, even if it was oversold. We'll talk through it shortly, but first, here's our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban's take.
This was spectacle, but was it diplomacy? The president boarded Air Force One to head back across the Pacific. His interlocutor left later on a borrowed Chinese plane. But although he caused quite a stir on the streets of Singapore, it wasn't even clear who was paying Kim's hotel bill. This was not a relationship of equals. And of course that applies to free media as well, and the way it processed the outcome.
What is your reaction to what has happened in the last 24 hours, Dr. Gorka?
Absolutely stunning.
Kim Jong-un himself has already scored a victory, and if he gets an invitation to the White House, that is icing on the cake.
For Kim, just having the meeting was a success and an opening to the outside world. As for his reliability in delivering, defectors suggest we shouldn't expect much.
Even though he said complete the denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, but including me, none of the North Korean defectors living in South Korea believes that. It's a joking. Maybe he can, he can lie to the world, he can hide something, but the world or America can't find exactly what the regime hiding behind their true face.
I really believe a lot of great things can happen. Yes, go ahead.
During a long press conference, an ebullient president amplified his own achievement, but even he conceded there was much to be worked out.
You said you defined success of this meeting by North Korea giving up its nuclear weapons.
Well, that's what they're doing.
Well, can you talk about how
sure,
you...
Sure, that's what they're doing.
Well,
I mean, I don't think
pressed Kim Jong-un for a complete, verifiable, irreversible
I did, honestly.
And can you say why you didn't secure those details in this agreement?
Because there's no time. I'm here one day. We're together for many hours intensively, but the process is now going to take place. And I would be surprised, Mike, if they haven't even started already. They have started. They blew up their sites. They blew up their testing site.
How do you ensure that North Korea is not all talk, no action?
Well, I think, can you ensure anything? Can I ensure that you're going to be able to sit down properly when you sit down? I mean, you can't ensure anything. All I can say is they want to make a deal. That's what I do. My whole life has been deals. I've done great at it.
Mr. President, it's been a busy...
There can now be confidence-building measures, starting with halting military exercises.
Under the circumstances that we're negotiating a very comprehensive, complete deal, I think it's inappropriate to be having war games. So number one, we save money a lot. And number two, it really is something that I think they very much appreciated.
And that Trumpian obsession with money and taking advantage of America emerged again when asked why he treats Kim with more deference than fellow G7 leaders.
I would like to involve Congress, yes. And no, I have a good relationship with Justin Trudeau. I really did. Other than he had a news conference that he had because he assumed I was in an airplane and I wasn't watching. He learned that's going to cost a lot of money for the people of Canada.
But there are regional dynamics also.
What do you, President Trump, expect Kim Jong-un to do about the human rights record regarding the North Korean people?
Right. It was discussed. It was discussed relatively briefly compared to denuclearization. Well, obviously, that's where we started and where we ended. But they will be doing things, and I think he wants to do things. I think he wants to. You'd be very surprised. Very smart, very good negotiator.
In South Korea, President Moon watched today with evident satisfaction. He wants to improve relations rapidly and could move on his own to build bridges with the North. China will also be pivotal. Having facilitated this summit, it may feel the results already justify an easing of sanctions on the North.
We see Air Koryo, the North Korean national carrier, now flying to multiple cities in China again. There are abundant reports of coal imports, of oil transfers at sea and elsewhere. And if you wanted to rent an office in one of the Chinese border towns near North Korea, you'd be paying twice or three times as much today as you were a month ago. And that's indicative of the active black market and gray market that has surged back in the aftermath of President Trump's announcement that he wanted to hold a summit with Kim Jong-un.
There are many different understandings then of what went on in Singapore, even among those who were in the room.
Getting a good picture, everybody, so we look nice and handsome and thin.
Beautiful.
Perfect.
Watch Kim's reaction to Trump's joshing. The president then leaves the summit with a headline-grabbing event.
You'll be meeting again, sir? What do you see each other again?
It'll please his base with its promise of avoiding war and cutting military costs, but it may be seen by many in the region as opening the way to normalisation with North Korea.
Mark Urban. Well, let's hear now from a US diplomat on the agreement reached and what it says about the conduct of US foreign policy more generally. Earlier, I spoke to the US ambassador to NATO. Now, she was appointed by President Trump last year, former Republican Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison. Team Trump often divides into two, those who like to stir things up and those who like to calm them down. She falls into the latter category. And I asked her if we should be worried there's nothing concrete we can say about what North Korea will give up.
I think it's a very strong first meeting with an actual agreement signed in which Kim Jong-un signs an agreement that the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is an agreed item. That's as far
towards
as
it, I think, isn't it? Is what the actual agreement says, I think, isn't it? Towards the denuclearization.
Well, there has to be a negotiation, which is acknowledged, of course. There has to be a verification from our point of view, but everyone acknowledges, including they both did, that there will be a vigorous negotiation for the ability to determine with experts that all of the nuclear facilities are identified and then, of course, destroyed in their nuclear capability.
So this is the start. I mean, it's clearly not the end. I don't know. Can you help us make sense of US foreign policy today? Because the president came out of the G7. His trade advisor said of Justin Trudeau, there's a special place in hell reserved for Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada. And yet he's so gushing about one of the world's most brutal and unpleasant dictators, Kim Jong-un.
Well, first of all, we have very strong allies, of which Canada is one, and we have ups and downs and agreements and disagreements with all of our allies. I see it in NATO every day, but it doesn't affect another area. And for instance, at NATO, Canada is one of our strongest allies, as are UK and France and Germany. And we do things together with a common goal at NATO.
But they insult each other. I mean, you know, it is a completely new style of diplomacy to speak about an ally like that, isn't it? I mean, this is not, we're in completely uncharted territories. And the West is desperately trying to work out what the heck you do and whether to take it seriously or just to ignore the words.
I don't think personal observations or criticisms are necessary, but sometimes some people operate in a different kind of a way, and generally it's for a purpose. And I think you saw that with President Trump and Kim Jong-un. I mean, early on, it was not friendly at all, and they traded insults, but it seems that they understood each other. They tried to understand how they were communicating. And I think what's happened today is amazing. I think the success of a first meeting between the head of North Korea and a U.S. president, I think is history-making.
What is going to happen if North Korea doesn't deliver, as it hasn't on previous occasions? We've been this far before, it hasn't delivered. What happens this time?
I will only correct you in a small way and say we haven't been this far before. We haven't had a sit-down and a signed agreement for the denuclearization.
Well, no, but we've had the promise of denuclearization before.
I think
I mean, we've had the same words. We haven't had the same theatre.
I think we're a bit farther than we've ever been before. But having said that, I think if North Korea doesn't come through with opening the books and making sure that the experts know where things are, then the sanctions will stay in place. And I think that's a good part of what brought them to the table in the first place.
Your job is ambassador to NATO. You've got a summit next month, a NATO summit next month. You must be dreading it. The tension between, literally, people talking of the breakdown of the West as a concept, with a president who has turned on his allies and linked trade deficits to all sorts of other areas, trade deficits to defence. Do you approve of the president linking trade and defence?
Well, I think we must stay on defence in NATO and talk about burden sharing on defence. And I am very focused on the security umbrella that NATO is for our Western alliance, for Europe, for North America, Canada, and the United States.
And the 2% is obviously Europe's embarrassment, because it doesn't deliver that by and large, the 2% target of GDP to spend on defence. But do you agree with the President's framing of the issue that the United States is in NATO as a grand favour to other countries, as opposed to a mutual benefit for all the countries?
If you look at it clearly, it's a fact that the United States puts in more than any of the allies. So from the standpoint of do we do the most, and is it very beneficial to Europe, which has been in 2 world wars, and the purpose of NATO was to keep that from happening again, then of course that's on the European side of getting a benefit. The benefit to America is that we have 29 countries that are freedom-loving, rule of law, human rights accepting countries that work together. So we're not going it alone. We're not doing all of this by ourselves with no backup.
Ambassador Hutchison, nice to talk to you.
Thank you, Evan.
She is a diplomat. Well, look, joining me now from Palo Alto is the former United States Ambassador to South Korea, Kathleen Stevens, and here in the studio is Gian Beck, the author of North Korea's Hidden Revolution. Gian, were you swept up in the hype today, or were you casting a more cynical eye over it?
I wish I was more optimistic with much of the watchers of the summit, but I must say I watched all the different events that unfolded with a healthy dose of skepticism, and that skepticism being anchored in history and a lot of the facts on the ground in North Korea that we know of how the country runs. And so I must say I do view this through a lens of skepticism.
Right. Kathleen Stevens, it looked as though flattery was the foreign policy, that, I mean, trying to flatter Kim Jong-un was the kind of way to bring him in from the cold. Do you think it can work in the way we'd like it to?
No, I don't think flattery alone can work. I think it's questionable whether it's even a good opening gambit. I would say, as your reporting a little earlier showed, this is a very Trumpian spectacle. I think that given the alternative, even in its very unconventional and Trumpian form, I welcome the fact that the two men met. I think it's a start. I did notice that Kim Jong-un did not do a lot of flattery, at least in his very restricted public comments. And I think, frankly, that President Trump, while I think it was worth the price, if you like, of elevating Kim Jong-un to get a dialogue going, to move the diplomatic track, I do think it went a little bit too far, more than a little too far in some of the comments that were made.
And you do have to concede that, you know, nothing else really seems to have worked, and so it doesn't cost much. What an airfare for a couple of hundred Americans to go to Singapore for a few days. In that sense, it does contrast positively with everything that maybe Obama did. You know, your president.
Well, I think, you know, we Americans, we do like to think that we're always the main actors here. But, you know, things also, I think, changed on the Korean Peninsula, both in terms of Kim Jong-un's own plan and timing, and also in terms of the new leadership in South Korea, which has played a big role in this. But no, I think this is not the way that I would have set up a summit, but I think that it was worth a go. But as I would agree that the statement that came out of it was quite disappointing. It certainly leaves a lot of work and a lot of questions. And with all due respect to Ambassador Hutchinson, who I much admire, the statement did not go as far, actually, as we went in 2005 under President George W. Bush in the Joint Statement of Principles for the Six Parties, or indeed in the 1990s. Okay. So we've got to make up for some lost ground in a more challenging situation now. It's a big challenge for President Trump. I just want to see what happens going forward.
Gian, tell us what this means in North Korea, because obviously by flattering Kim Jong-un, you could increase his legitimacy. I don't know, does he use that?
I wish I knew how this impacts North Korean people and North Korea as a state. I think that from just sort of general observations is that it does boost, it will boost his domestic legitimacy back at home. This is just sort of based on what he seeks to continue to. I mean, he has a long way to go. He's a young man, and you know, without barring any other major interventions, he has many decades in power. So I think it will boost his standing at home, not because he's lucky enough to meet the American president, but he is a peer. He's a peer to the most powerful man in the world, that being President Trump.
Human rights didn't seem to play very high. I mean, they said they did talk about them, and Trump said, you know, I think he wants to change.
It did not play a role at all. From what I can gather, President Trump did say in the news conference that they briefly discussed it behind closed doors. You know, God knows what words were exchanged. I think that it was a huge disappointment. What better gesture could the leader of the free world make than to bring up a very critical component of a nation that we would welcome to be a peer country to the international community of nations?
Kathleen Stevens, one way of looking at what has happened here is that unconventional diplomacy seems to have done something, you know, playing a video to Kim Jong-un and strange sort of blowing hot and cold. Clearly, President Trump thinks this has achieved something. Do you think he now goes much further with unconventional diplomacy, so to speak?
Well, I think for President Trump, he's going to continue to put a big emphasis on, if you like, the show and the ceremony. And actually, in that way, that's important to North Korea, too. And I agree this is going to give him Kim Jong-un greater domestic legitimacy. And I actually think that's in part intentional by President Trump. This is part of making him feel more secure. Maybe that's not a bad thing, although I think we all have some good reasons to feel some qualms about it. I also think that President Trump may be onto something in terms of emphasizing the attraction of economic development for North Korea. This is a young man who I think hopes to be in power 50 years from now, and he also hopes to be the leader of a country that looks more like South Korea or China or some of the Asian tigers, as we used to call them, than it does the impoverished state that he now rules over. So I think appealing to that economic development is actually not a bad ploy. It's not a new one, but it's done in a Trumpian way. My concern is that I think Kim Jong-un has left the summit thinking that he may well be able to have his cake and eat it too. Yeah. That is, to retain some nuclear and missile capability. And also, he's already gotten some relief from sanctions just because of the lower tensions. But that eventually he may be able to actually emerge with acquiescence in a nuclear program and North Korea as a more normal state.
And Jian, who do you think actually won today? Do you think, I mean, some people have written this up as Kim managed to work over Trump and played him like a fool. Do you buy that take?
I don't. I think that both leaders do view the summit as a success in their own right. They both have successes to take back home and please their bases. And not that North Korean leader has to please any base in particular as a dictator. But I think that the people who didn't win at all are the North Korean citizens of his country. The human rights issue was not addressed at all. And there's nothing that he can take home that can substantively improve the well-being of a single average North Korean citizen.
Jian, Ambassador Kathleen Stevens, thank you both very much indeed.